For the agenda today, we're going to hit on three primary topics. What does identity-centric PAM mean? And what are the typical industry requirements that it addresses? We'll talk about the fundamental tenets of a identity-centric PAM and how we apply them to mitigate against cybersecurity breaches. And we'll take a deeper look at Centrify's architecture, and time permitting, we'll have a little practical application exercise demonstrating Centrify's solution. So what exactly does identity-centric mean, and how does it apply to PAM? Well, like the name implies, identity, and probably more precisely the securing of identities, is at the center of the various components that define a PAM solution. As we'll see in the next several slides, identities are not just user identities, but can also entail computers, workloads, and processes. Right? So especially as we start to move into humanless compute, with less and less direct interaction with our systems, those microservices, the accounts themselves need to have identity. So when we talk about PAM, many organizations, including analyst firms, are historically focused on privileged account and session management, or in simple terms, a password vault. And by applying PASM, as they've created the acronym for it, privileged root and local administrative accounts are protected, and they're protected by vaulting and managing their credentials, rotating them when they're accessed and such. Access to those accounts is then brokered for human users for services and applications by injecting the credentials during remote access sessions or application-to-application sessions, things of that nature. For privileged sessions, it's considered a best practice to audit everything when possible, and the privileged access compliant auditing capabilities provide a documented record of all the actions that are performed that not only can be used for governance purposes, but also for forensic analysis to find exactly the issues and attribute them to specific user sessions. With Centrify, session recordings are made available in a video stream that can be reviewed or used as evidence for your most critical access or assets, or in highly regulated industries. Unlike vault-centric PAM providers, we provide customers with the ability to record sessions in two places. Most other PAM providers will provide recording at a gateway or a junction box or jump host scenario. And we do that, but we also provide the ability to have host-based recording. Host-based recording ensures that sessions can't be bypassed. For example, if an admin finds a way to go directly to the target system as opposed to going through the gateway, you're not going to record if you're not going through the gateway. When you have host-based auditing enabled, you're recording everything. And that includes things that non-human accounts are doing, service accounts and such, and being able to tie those back to the account, to the user, whatever the case may be. And it also will index those sessions so that they're searchable as well. Now, while those capabilities are the foundation in securing privileged access, organizations really should go beyond the vault and apply privileged elevation and delegation management, or PEDM, as the analyst firms have designated it. Under PEDM, specific granular privileges are granted on the managed systems by host-based agents to the authenticated privileged users. This includes both host-based access and privilege elevation. The latter in the form of allowing predefined commands to be run with a higher level of privilege, or applications in the case of Windows. Additionally, privileges can be granted only for a short amount of time, and ultimately that's what we really want to achieve, is just-in-time access and privilege. Now, the final component is privileged identity and access management. I don't know how to pronounce PIAM, so I'm not going to try to, but that's the acronym that they've created for it. It's important to establish that an identity upfront for users via an HR-vetted enterprise directory, such as Active Directory. And the benefits there are twofold. We can use that single source of identity of truth or single source of truth to grant them privileges. And these identities can be automatically disabled when a person's terminated or changed as they change roles. So in this case, instead of logging into a server as a shared account where there's anonymity involved, administrators are able to leverage their individual identity to authenticate to the system. Now, this provides the ability to have very granular controls, as mentioned in the PEDM section as well. When we think about a traditional vaulting type approach where users are logging in as a shared powerful account like the root account, I kind of equate it to if you think about a traditional vault of 4 steel walls and 3-foot thick concrete on the floor and on the ceiling with gold bricks inside. You don't take a gold brick out to go to Starbucks to buy a cup of coffee. That's kind of the equivalent of checking out the root password to go restart the Apache service. So to get a better understanding of identity-centric PAM, let's take a look real quickly at the underlying zero trust principles that it adheres to. You've probably seen plenty of messaging over the past several years around the marketing term zero trust. Forrester coined it several years ago. It's been the marketing buzzword for a while, the concept of never trust and always verify. But not many vendors offer the complete zero trust picture, with allowing enterprises to also enforce true least privilege. So I'm going to briefly mention each of these principles, and then we'll dive into each one in a little bit more detail. So first, we're going to start with establishing trust. Now, this is about creating a unique identity for systems where you want to enforce authoritative security policies via the management platform. Things like anonymous access accounts should no longer be an accepted standard, though from time to time they'll be needed from a break glass scenario. We want to avoid those as much as possible. We want to verify who. So today, identities include not just people, but workloads and services and machines and microservices and containers. So especially when we start talking about the increased footprint of those platforms and containerization, we want to make sure we know who is performing the function, whether that is a human or a non-human account. Properly verifying who means leveraging enterprise directory identities for the authentication and authorization process. By doing so, we achieve both accountability and attestation of the identity requesting the access. Now, will there be times where an admin needs to break the glass, as I mentioned, and retrieve a privileged credential, use it for emergency purposes? Of course, right? It could be a Linux machine that won't come back online and sitting in a single user prompt, but that should be the exception rather than the rule. We want to contextualize the request. That seems like a fancy word, contextualize, but it's important to have zero standing privileges. And this is an end goal that we want to get to. Instead, have the ability to elevate our privileges with context to make just-in-time access decisions, right? Is there a change record? Is there a service ticket? What is the reason that I need this privilege at this time? So we should be associating these requests with those things, having that reason validated, having it approved so that we know and can track the reason for these elevations. We want to secure the administrative environment. When we're accessing privileged resources, it's critical that we don't either enable malware to access the servers or introduce infections of ransomware, for example, during those connections. So to achieve this, we need to make sure that access is only taking place through a clean source. Applying zero trust principles means preventing direct access from the user's workstation that has access to the internet and email, which are too easily infected with malware. Finally, we want to grant least privilege. Least privilege means giving them just enough privilege just in time and limiting lateral movement. So just enough privilege to get the job done. What do I really need to perform my job function? As a web admin, do I need to be full root on that Red Hat server? Highly unlikely, right? I need to be able to manage the Apache service. So making sure that we're limiting the amount of privilege that a user has, giving it to them in just the amount of time that they need it for to perform their job function. We want to audit everything, right? So with a documented record of all the actions that are performed, audit logs can not only be used in forensic analysis to find exactly the issue, to attribute actions to a specific user. These sessions are critical. It's also best practice to keep a video recording of the session that can be reviewed and used as evidence. Now, from a security perspective, that all makes sense. And a lot of folks think that we as security practitioners, and once upon a time before I joined the dark side and went to work for a vendor, I was a real security person. Everybody thinks that our job is to slap people's wrists and tell them what not to do. And while that might be the fun part of the job, our job is really just to make sure that the business stays up and running, that it continues to be profitable, right? If we're talking about in a corporate environment. So this is very useful from the perspective of break fix as well, right? 9 times out of 10, when something goes wrong with a service or a server, it's not nefarious. Obviously, there is that other 10% or so. A lot of times it's human error. If we can detect what happened in a timely fashion, we get the business back up and running that much quicker. So if I had to sum up these principles, in one sentence, probably going to be a little bit of a long run-on sentence, but it would be to establish the root of trust, granting least privileged access based on verifying who's requesting that access, the context of their request, and the risk of the access to the environment that the originating request is coming from. So by using these principles, an organization can minimize the attack surface, improve audit and compliance posture, reduce the risk of breach, and reduce the cost and complexity of a hybrid enterprise. So we need to establish trust. What does that mean? In order for systems to enforce an authoritative security policy, each must have a securely established unique identity with the authoritative security management platform. In this case, being Centrify. It's no longer acceptable in today's threatscape to allow management systems to use anonymous access accounts or inject credentials like it typically happens with vaulted, shared super user accounts, as they can't really be strongly verified for security operations. We want to verify who. Right? As I mentioned, identities now include not only people, but also workloads and services and machines and microservices. This is one of the primary reasons to leverage existing enterprise directory identities, whether that's Active Directory or LDAP or Azure AD or Google Directory Services, whatever you have, or the multitude thereof, right? You might have multiple identity stores. Being able to centrally manage access to your systems from these disparate identity stores. Right? So this certainly helps to reduce the attack surface by eliminating local accounts and decreasing the overall number of accounts and passwords. The important part here is to consolidate and establish identity for the users via the company-sanctioned identity repository. The last thing you want is IT staff who are part of the latest company RIF. It's unpleasant, but it happens, especially recently. It seems to be happening a lot. We don't want people that have just been RIFed to still retain their privileged access rights to be able to do something nefarious on your network. We want to be able to adhere to Microsoft's best practice for privileged access and use secondary privileged accounts, -A account, a Z account, an admin account. And y'all are mostly probably aware of these as most organizations we speak to use them for their IT staff. And the problem with these accounts is that they get abused and the credentials are oftentimes not managed in a vault. Speaking from experience, once upon a time, when I've had these accounts, I may have been guilty of it, and I bet that a few of you have been as well. Our admins will just log in with that -A account all the time, right? Just to be more efficient, not because they're trying to be bad, but it just saves them time. The problem with that is when you're logged in as that administrative account all the time, it defeats the purpose of having that account in the first place. So we'll see in the upcoming least privilege slide how we can move to a true least privilege model instead. Finally, utilizing multi-factor authentication. Right now, in my personal life, I always try to make it a point not to use a service that doesn't enable second factor or multi-factor authentication, right? And for those that can, I make sure I keep a much closer eye on them. We should absolutely be applying this type of logic to the enterprise where critical systems and resources reside. Centrify's longstanding mantra has been MFA everywhere. You'll see during the demo as we get there a few different ways where we can apply various levels of multi-factor authentication during the connection stream. Right? Whether it's logging into the vault, whether it's logging into a system directly, whether it's even at privilege elevation, being able to provide that multi-factor authentication. Okay. There's always a fine line between security and usability. We don't want to upset the users too much or be a barrier for their access, but MFA policies don't have to be that burdensome. With today's rich offerings, it's easy to apply context to the access to be able to do things like enable pass-through windows or activate mobile push notifications. Apply MFA where you need to, when you need to, right? Again, we have to skate that fine line between security and usability. We do provide the capabilities to do so in every aspect, though. Contextualizing the request. Okay. We need to know why somebody or something is performing a privileged activity. We have to understand the context behind the request. And we need to review and approve those requests based on that context that's provided. The concept of least privilege is to only provide the needed level of privilege to perform a certain task, and only for the amount of time necessary to perform that task. In order to execute on least privilege, the approver needs to understand the whys, right, to be able to make the appropriate access decision. So recording the request context typically includes associating the request with a trouble ticket or a change record, providing a reason as well as what is being requested, what the actual activity will be, and for how long. And once that request is contextualized, it needs to be routed for approval. And that could be one approver or a set of approver, multiple steps. It can even be orchestrated, right, through something like an ITSM tool like a ServiceNow, or through an IGA tool like a SailPoint, where I don't necessarily have that privilege on a permanent basis. It might be something that I need regularly. It might not need to be approved by a person, but I still need to go through that process and have it automated so that it's just in time. I don't have that capability all the time. I log into any system and I'm a regular user, right, is the idea. So we want to have a secure administrative environment. And when we're accessing privileged resources, it's absolutely critical that we don't introduce infections like malware during our connections. So to achieve this, we need to make sure that access is only going through a clean source. How do we ensure a clean source? Well, we don't want to allow direct access from a user workstation, right? From home PCs and such. Most of us are probably still working from home. Whether that was your norm beforehand or not, I know some folks are starting to get back into the office, but a lot of us are still working from home. We may or may not be getting our updates that we would have been getting on the corporate network. So if we're using our corporate machines, you may be using a personal machine, right, where the same amount of discretion might not be applied. Anecdotally, I live in South Florida. My folks live in Maryland. I go home to visit for the holidays. And this past Christmas season, I was up there and I decided not to take my work laptop because I was on vacation. I didn't want to have to work. And of course, Murphy's Law says that that's when I get the page saying, hey, there's something broken inside. We need you to fix it. So I go to my parents' computer, which is probably the same desktop computer they've had since I was in high school. I'm 43 years old. I opened up a web browser and sure enough, there were more toolbars on that screen than window. I don't want that thing on my corporate network. Right? So being able to have the ability to facilitate a gateway, a secure environment, right, where we can have a pass-through, where my machine is not actually talking to the target system to prevent any of that infection. So privileged admin consoles can include a web-based access to those sensitive systems via a lockdown clean server gateway that serves kind of as a jump host or a bastion host. A properly designed system will allow admins to access machines through the client of their choice, whether it's a browser or native clients like PuTTY or Secure CRT or your native RDP, or through fat clients, right? Toad, SQL Management Server, things like that. Distributed jump hosts or any number of other descriptions you want to use, right? I mentioned bastion hosts and gateways or proxies, all at the end of the day, similar concepts. They serve a dual purpose for load balancing in the same network and for supporting multiple different private networks. And these connectors reside where the resources are located, whether that's on-prem and DMZs and infrastructure as a service like AWS or Azure or GCP, within business partner networks or in VPNs. So we'll take a closer look at this very important part of the architecture in the next few slides. And the beauty of a properly designed zero trust privileged administrative environment is it must not allow remote staff to access resources, or must not only allow remote staff to access resources 24/7, but it's perfect for outsourced IT users too, because it alleviates the need for a VPN and handles all the secure communication between the secure clients and the distributed connectors. Right? So if you have offshore development or outsourced IT or vendors that need access to the particular systems that they're managing for you, being able to give them surgical access to that specific machine without giving them a VPN, without having them in your Active Directory, right? Without having to manage their account. Right? All this comes into play as well. Some of the things that we'll talk about as we move forward are, with the identity stores, being able to have federation with your third parties, okay, and being able to control who from their environment has access to your things. As soon as they're disabled on their own side, they automatically lose access to your stuff. Least privilege. This is key, and this is really why we're here. right? We want to talk about making sure that our users have just the amount of access that they need to do their jobs. Least privilege is a pretty common term. We've all heard of the principle of least privilege for years now, but a lot of folks don't really think they can achieve it, or some might not even quite grasp what it really means. So if you think about physical access controls at your office, right? Different levels of users have different access rights to get in different areas. You might not be able to badge into every single door, right? Not everybody can badge into the server room, right? If you still have those, I know a lot of us still do, or being able to get into every single office. Your key card is key to give you access to specific areas, right? We want to apply that same concept that we've been using in the physical security space to logical security or digital security, right? So it applies whether you're granting, granular role-based access controls to privileged resources, or from system to system. So if we were to take this perhaps to an uncomfortable and inconvenient level, none of you should have access to any resources right now. Everybody that's on the phone, you're stuck in here listening to me, right? You don't need access. The ideal end state is to deliver just enough access just in time, right? So that when we hang up and now it's time to go back to work, you get your access when you need it, right? And you get just the amount of access that you need. But because right now, I know you're all paying rapt attention to every word coming out of my mouth, and you're not working on anything else, you shouldn't have access to any of those things. Another objective to limiting privilege is to limit lateral movement across the network. This is the primary way that attackers get access to sensitive data. They start in one location and they move laterally until they find what they're looking for. Now, if we zone off what they have access to, then we can stop that lateral movement and drastically limit the attack surface. Just like nobody should have single key badge access that accesses everything in the building, you really don't want to have that root account access on a server, right? Certainly not to every server in the organization. That gives too much access and has no attribution to the actual user, right? Instead, that user should log in with his or her regular entitlements that give him access to restart the server. If he needs to change a config, then he has to request access for a specific period of time through something like ServiceNow, and maybe be asked for a multi-factor authentication. And once that's complete, that user's entitlement should reduce back to being just a regular user. We need to audit everything. Now, I say that, and a lot of folks go, well, that's a lot of data. Well, it can be, but it's very important that we do this, right? Especially for these privileged sessions. For privileged sessions, of course, it's best practice to audit everything. With a documented record of all the actions performed, it not only can be used in forensic analysis to find exactly the issue and attribute it to a specific user in session, but it can also be utilized for those evidentiary proceedings, as I mentioned, and from break fix, right? We want to make sure that we're monitoring these critical assets and everything that's happening on them. So note that monitoring and session recording can be achieved, as I mentioned, either through a gateway or through a host-based technique. Right? Those host-based sessions are going to give you much more fidelity. They're going to give you even added, as I'll show in a few moments, additional benefits as you start to put these things together. Right? Now, if you have a strong security department, it's important to know that all this audit data can be mined, and risky activities can be identified and alerted on through your SIM or your CASB or your UBI tools, whatever you happen to be using. Right. So from a Centrify perspective, everything that's happening is being logged in either syslog or Windows event log, dependent upon the type of system we're talking about, and designated as being a Centrify event with context. Right. Back to that contextualization, so that all of that can be fed into your correlation engine or your SIM to be able to have alerting and reporting. So how is Centrify delivering these capabilities? The Centrify platform, it comes with built-in capabilities like an access and approval workflow engine, multi-factor authentication service, unified policy management. It's got a cloud directory. It's got a connector gateway. And on top of the platform, we deliver a set of integrated services with functionality in 5 critical areas. So the privileged access service allows customers to establish the core privileged access controls against your growing attack surface. Now, when most people hear PAM, the first thing they think of is a vault. Right? The privileged access service is, at its heart, it is our vault. right? It does a lot more than that, but that's what you have to start with, right? That's a good place to start. You locking up those local or domain accounts that have super privilege, right? That might be shared from time to time. We want to lock them in the vault. We want to rotate them on a regular basis, and anytime they're checked out, right? So that's the privileged access service. The authentication service provides customers with the needed capabilities to go beyond a password vault and reduce their attack surface by consolidating identities. Right? This eliminates a lot of the local accounts, as many as we can get out of those systems. We want to get out of those systems. So whether this is bridging Unix and Linux systems to Active Directory, or having that multi-directory brokering, like I mentioned, right? Whether that's Azure AD or GCP or whatever you might be utilizing, LDAPs for your identity stores, right? Having the authentication there reduces the need for those local accounts, provides greater attribution, and also from a cleanup standpoint, right? Somebody leaves the organization instead of having to find all of those accounts on all of those machines and clean them up. The privilege elevation service empowers customers to implement privilege elevation controls, as the name might suggest, as well as workflow for just-in-time privileged access. So what that means, in simple terms, centralized sudoers, right, is a really good way to look at it. And so instead of having sudoers files on all of your Unix and Linux systems throughout your environment, having them all centrally located inside of Active Directory. Now, the authentication service and privilege elevation service together were our initial offering. We've been around for about 16 years now. We started off as AD and Unix Linux bridging. We took the authentication to the next step, which was authorization, right? Centralized sudoers, being able to control from a central location what users can do in a role-based way. We don't make any schema modifications to Active Directory. We don't put any software on domain controllers. It's all stored in an OU. Right? There's an agent that goes on those systems when you log in, just like when you log into your Windows box. It's checking your credentials against that OU, right? Is your username and password valid, first and foremost? Then what can you do? A, are you allowed to log into this box in the first place? And if so, what commands can you run? Similarly, it does the same thing for Windows. Right? Obviously, the authentication piece, in most cases, when Active Directory is present, is of less concern. Right? Windows natively joins AD, obviously, but being able to control what our administrators can do on those Windows systems from a central location as well. This provides reporting capabilities too. So, if as many of you probably have been on the receiving end of the tap on the shoulder from the audit department saying, "Hey, I need to know who can do what and where." Having centralized reporting makes your life a lot easier. In fact, you can even give them access to the reports so you don't have to do it either. Just makes life a lot easier. The audit and monitoring service is what allows our customers to be able to fulfill their compliance mandates through session recording. Right? We've talked about this a couple times, right? Whether it's through the gateway or through host-based audit and monitoring. One of the things I want to point out as I'm building this out, you see how it's a puzzle. Right? Each of these things is a puzzle piece. I'm not usually a big fan of architecture, but I like this one. I always show this one in all my demos because these things do start to have, the sum is greater than, or the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I can never get that saying right. But the idea here is kind of a 1 + 1 = 3 is what you have going on. When you have the audit and monitoring service in conjunction with the privilege elevation service, you can actually disable someone's ability to elevate their privilege if they've manipulated or circumvented or disabled the audit and monitoring service, right? If they've turned off session recording, you can prevent them from raising their privilege, right? We want to make sure they're not trying to cover their tracks. Similarly, with the privilege elevation service and the privileged access service. The privileged access service it has the just-in-time capabilities. It has the MFA capabilities. So when you have these two things together, you're able to apply multi-factor authentication at system log, directly at system login for the authentication service, and at privilege elevation when you're running a sudo command, for example, or elevating your privilege in Windows being prompted for multi-factor authentication. So all these things start to build upon each other. And finally, we have the privileged threat analytics service. And this leverages advanced behavioral analytics and adaptive multi-factor authentication through additional buzzwords like machine learning and AI what this does, it provides an additional layer of security, right, to allow for real-time alerting of abnormal user behavior and real-time behavioral change. So it might be that I'm trying to log into a system that I have the rights to log into, but I don't do it on a regular basis. That is an anomaly, right? Or I might be coming from a Windows machine when I have a Mac. I hardly ever use Windows. I'm doing something for Windows that might send my threat score up just a little bit. That in conjunction with the time of day or the day of the week or my geography or my travel velocity, how quick I've moved between sites, along with what systems I'm trying to access, all of those things get combined together to generate a risk score. And we can create policy as it ties in with the privileged access service and the privilege elevation service and the authentication service. Generate action based on that. Prompt me for MFA where I might not normally be required to use it, or stop me from performing that action if my risk score is too high. So talking about the architecture a bit, the way that Centrify has been architected, if we think about it, it's really a hub and spoke model. Now, the Privileged Access Service was developed as a cloud-first platform. We were the first PAM as a service, if you will. We are the only PAM as a service that is also FedRAMP certified. So some of you probably either have direct dealings with the federal government or have customers who do that are required to adhere to FedRAMP. FedRAMP is basically what says a federal agency is allowed to utilize your cloud service. Okay. You kind of think of it like SOC 2 on steroids, right? It's about twice as many requirements that you have to meet and more regularly ongoing recertification. We also can deliver it as a customer managed or on-prem type solution, where we basically give you the exact same product, you just deploy it on your own infrastructure, right? You kind of think of it like the difference between Office 365 and Exchange. From an end user perspective, it's the same functionality, right? I'm still getting my mail, still getting my calendar, still getting my tasks, all that fun stuff. But from an administrative perspective, I don't have to worry about updates and backup and high availability and all that kind of stuff, right? Scalability. But the functionality is still the same. The way that we work from a hub and spoke model, we have these guys, we call them connectors. We're very original in our naming conventions. It connects things. The connector does a lot. Okay, so it proxies the authentication in real time. So when I log in, as I'm about to in the demonstration, I'm going to log into the privileged access service. I'm logging in real time with my Active Directory credentials. Now, we don't do a DIR sync. We're not replicating AD into the privileged access service, into the platform. It's a real-time authentication. These connectors are phoning home outbound over 443. So there's no firewall holes to punch usually. You might need to allow outbound over 443, but a lot of environments already allow that. Right? So outbound over 443, there's a PKI-based mutual authentication that takes place. And once that happens, there's an AES 256-bit encrypted persistent tunnel that's created. What that means is once that handshake happens, we can talk back and forth over that line. Okay, it's a persistent tunnel, always up. We always recommend deploying at least 2 connectors at any given time for high availability and automatic load balancing. But what happens is when I log into the privileged access service, it's making that LDAP call across the line that's been connected or being created by that tunnel, where it's then calling into Active Directory and validating my credentials, looking at my groups within Active Directory, which have been assigned Centrify roles, and saying what I can do once I'm in there. The connector also can be utilized as that jump box, that bastion host, where it will launch my SSH or RDP connections for me and proxy them back to me, right? That keeping me off of that box directly. It's the gateway where the recordings are taking place as well. All this is taking place in a single service. If you look at some of the competition that's out there and you start looking at the architecture and infrastructure that's involved, each of those things that I just mentioned requires a separate component that they charge for. We don't charge for the connector. So from a total cost of ownership perspective, that lowers things dramatically. All right. So with that, I'm going to kind of finish up with the slides. Stop boring you with those, and we'll jump into a little bit of a demo. So as we see here, the Privileged Access Service has a web-based interface. The entire product's actually built on a REST API. So everything that I'm about to show you, from a GUI perspective can actually be done programmatically as well, right? The real product is the API. So everything can be done programmatically. This enables for a lot of that, humanless compute to take place as well, but also from a management perspective. What we're looking at here is really just a JavaScript emulation of that API. I'm going to log in. First thing you'll see is I'm going to be prompted for my token. Now I have a number of different MFA mechanisms I can use. This is my demo environment, so I've got pretty much all of them configured here. In most cases, you might have one or two. We even allow the ever-dreaded security question. I always recommend it against it for obvious reasons, but if you must use it, you can make your end users' lives miserable by making them answer as many as 10. In this case, I'm going to use my FIDO2 enabled on-device authenticator. What that means, it's my fingerprint reader on my laptop, right? Making sure it's really me. Biometrics, it's a great thing. And now my Active Directory password, which I will try to type correctly while I'm speaking. And I think I did. Fantastic. All right, so this is the administrative console. Now in this environment, I am a read-only system administrator. It means I can see everything. Can't really make any changes. Don't want me breaking anything. That's a good thing. But that means I have a lot more on my left-hand side here from an administrative perspective of what I can do in the menu. We're going to focus on what the end user experience is like though. So most of our end users will spend their time in the workspace. The workspace is where I have the systems I access on a regular basis. Now, if we talk about from the vaulting perspective of the privileged access service, we can request an account, right? I can request the root account, for example. We see it's got a lock next to it. That means that I have to make a request. This is that contextualized request, right? Do I need it on a temporary or permanent basis? From when to when, and why do I need that? This can be tied into a ticket as well, or a change control, whatever the case may be. In this case, though, I'm going to log in using, for the first demonstration, using my own account, my Active Directory account. Right? So this is a Red Hat box that's been joined to Active Directory using the authentication service. It's going to allow me to log in with my Active Directory credentials. I could type them in, username and password, but we also enable the ability to have what we call use my account. What's happening here, it's validated my identity already. We're going to issue a very short-lived SSH certificate, as opposed to an SSH key. SSH keys are very convenient. They're convenient for the bad guys too. They don't expire. They tend to proliferate, right? It's like a giant janitor's key ring full of keys in your SSH store, right? Instead, very short-lived SSH certificate that's going to log me in. As I log in, we'll see I'm logged in as myself, right? Brian.Carmen. If I say AD info, it's going to tell me I'm joined to Active Directory. I have a domain controller that I'm talking to right now. Okay. Now, if I need to do something though, right? I'm logged in as a regular user. Actually, one thing I wanted to show you real quick. If we take a look, there's no local user here for me. Right? It's my Active Directory account. It creates a home directory for me, just like on your Windows machine. You don't have a local account on your Windows laptop, your regular desktop machine, whatever it may be. You have a home directory though, right? So same thing's happening here. We're logging in with AD credentials. We're not creating a local account, but I need to do something. Say I need to restart the Apache service, or I need to view the logs, right? So I need to take a look at the var log messages file, right? It's syslog. You see if I type in my password, I can be prompted for multi-factor authentication here, right? Do a push notification to my phone in this case real quick. Just takes a second to come through. And once it does, I'm not in the sudoers file, right? I don't have any rights on this machine. Instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to request access temporarily to be able to do that. Okay. This is that just-in-time privilege, just-in-time access to this box. I'm going to request a zone role. In this case, I could request essentially full root access. Not going to. That's overkill. I'm going to request the ability to read that log file. It's a protected file. I'm going to say I need it temporarily. I just need it for 1 minute after approval. For 5 minutes. That's all it's going to take us. We can tie it to ticket 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And it's because I'm doing a webinar for you fine folks. I submit that request. Now, as that's going through, I've got a buddy of mine that's watching for this, so I'll give him a heads up that it was going to be coming through. As that request is approved, do a refresh here. I'll have that capability. So when I log back in to this Red Hat box, again, using my account, I'm going to have the access to do what I need to do. Now, I might start off, oops. I mentioned a lot of problems happen aren't necessarily nefarious, it's human error. I fat finger things all the time. If I try to access that, I'm going to get permission denied, right? Because it's a protected file. But I'm going to run what we call DZ-do. It's our substitute for sudo. And now I run it. And again, I'll be prompted for multi-factor authentication. You don't have to do this at every single command, right? It's that fine line, again, between security and usability. Decide where you want to apply it. You know, if you think about a web admin, for example, starting and stopping the Apache service is fairly trivial, but editing the HTTPD config file is where you can really cause some damage, right? Multi-factor them when they're going to do that. Anytime you're giving anybody the ability to SU to root, multi-factor them, right? In this case, just to provide that example, we see I'm able to access the logs. Because I could actually delete the logs with this particular command, it's a good thing to multi-factor me here as well. From a Windows standpoint, it's going to be very similar. If I go to this Windows machine here, I'm going to request a very similar, actually it's the same role. It's been assigned to both Windows and Linux. Read events, right? So as I request that, again, just on a temporary basis, oops. And once that's approved, all right. Now in this case, I'm going to log in as myself. I hope I got that right. Now we see I have two options here, right? If I were on the network, if I were on the VPN, I'm not on the VPN. If I were on the network, I could actually launch my native RDP tool, my local RDP tool, right, and have my full functionality of RDP. In this case, I'm going to use a web client, right? It's a web emulation. This is another function of that connector. The connector is launching the RDP session and presenting it to me as a web emulation. So the connector has a web server built into it as well. There we go. Now again, we could apply multi-factor authentication at login here, right? The agent-based access enables us to have MFA at system login, right? We can have it through the vault at any step along the way, right? At checkout, at login. But if you're going directly to the system and you're not going through the vault, you're not going through the gateway, having that agent-based gives you the ability to have multi-factor there as well. So very briefly, you know, I requested that same right for log management. If I open up Event Viewer without doing anything, Event Viewer it's on every system, right? Everybody can open it. Everybody can open every Windows application. But if I go to the security tab of the Windows event logs, I'm going to get a big red X. It says, hey, you're not allowed to do this. You have to be a local admin to do that. Well, what I can do, much like I have DZ-do, I can right click it and I can say run with privilege, right? This is elevating my privilege. I was granted that role because I just asked for it, right? Just in time privilege. I've got it for 5 minutes just to do this demo. Again, I can prompt for multi-factor authentication. I approve it, and it's going to go ahead and launch the window. And we'll see now, as I open up the security tab, my 32,000 plus events are available to me. I can see those. Now, what's happening here, though, we're granting privilege in this application and in this window only, right? So as that's building out, it'll populate. It's a little bit slow these days with 32,000 events in it. But as I open up another window of Event Viewer, same application, without elevating privilege, I'm still going to get that big red X, right? So it's relegated to this one window. When we're allowing our users to log in as local admin on these boxes, everything they do is as the administrator. That means every single application is running as the administrator, right? In this case, we're saying just this one application in just this window. Again, everything's being recorded as well. So very briefly, the last bit of this demonstration, and then we'll open it up. I know we got about 10 minutes left. We'll open up. I'm hoping that there's some questions. We'll take a look real quick at what the recordings look like. Launch this guy here. And we should see everything that I just did. Now what we're doing, we're actually utilizing another feature of the privileged access service to do this. We're utilizing our desktop apps feature. It's essentially providing additional controls over Windows remote desktop services, right? So giving me access to a single application on this server, logged in as a privileged account that I never see the password to. I don't know the password to it. I can't even check that password out, but it logs me in, it logs that it was me that was doing so into this one application, right? Now, as I'm taking a look at today's recordings, we see there's a whole bunch of me, right? So if we take a look at this last one here, this is what we just did, right? Everything that I just did in that session has been recorded, even my fat finger that we'll see right there. Right? So everything that I do is being recorded, right? Everything I type, all of the output, everything's contextualized. You see on the left-hand side, everything is being indexed as well, right? So this is searchable. This was over the course of less than a minute and a half that all of that took place. Think about an 8 to 10 hour workday. There's a lot more going on there. We're not even looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking for a needle in a stack of needles. This might be a server farm. We don't know what happened. We know that a business critical application is no longer functioning. We know around what time. We can do a search through this for anything mentioning that application, jump to that portion of the recording on all systems, right? Jump right to that portion of the recording instead of having to look through everything, figure out what went wrong and back out of it, right? That's that break fix. That's really nice to have. If you look at the Windows side, oops, that's this one, the one that I'm in currently. That won't do us any good. Similarly here, we see from the Windows side, obviously it's graphical, right? We're seeing as I'm logging in everything that I did when I was accessing the Windows event viewer. Now in this case, what you notice, there's not a whole lot going on the left-hand side. This particular recording is a gateway-only recording. This is not using the agent-based recording. This is another shortcoming of gateway-based recording for everybody when it comes to Windows. With our agent-based recording, you actually get the full details of what the user was doing as opposed to just a video recording, right? When you're only recording at the gateway, that's a shortcoming across the board, right? Not specific just to us. I think this one looks like it might be, there we go. So this is one where the agent-based was done, right? So similarly to the Linux, instead of what I'm typing, it's capturing, because it's graphical, it's capturing what window, what application, right? But it's all searchable. Right, we can jump in, we know when privilege was elevated, we can jump to those portions of the recording. It's also configurable. You don't have to record everything. You might only want to record when privilege is elevated. You might only want to record on certain systems, right? It might only be necessary on prod versus dev. All of that can be configurable. It's very granular. So with that said, I think we've run through the vast majority of the Centrify platform. I hope that I've provided some educational value as to what we offer, as well as to some best practices around managing your privilege. So we've gone through the privileged access service, the authentication service, the privilege elevation service, and the audit and monitoring service. I didn't have time to dive into the threat analytics service a whole lot, unfortunately, but Christine, if there's any questions, or Mason, if you can facilitate.
We do have a couple of questions. So the first one is it possible to implement just enough PAM using only Centrify PAS?
Using only PAS. Yes. Well, in combination with the multi-directory brokering, right? With the client that we have, the PAS has its own client. So as we're evolving, we've got two different clients. We've got one that's specifically for Active Directory bridging that ties right into AD, right? And that's looking at that OU inside of Active Directory, as I mentioned. We have a new client. We're calling it, coincidentally, the Cloud client, C client, that joins systems into PAS. When it does that, that system has an identity. That system is able to pull a sudoers file from PAS that's stored as a secret. We're able to expose centrify roles in PAS as local groups, so that you can actually have those local groups in those sudoers files that are being pulled down. So yes, it can be. It's a little bit of a different process, but at the end of the day, from an end user perspective, it's the exact same. From an administrative perspective, it's slightly different. I actually think that it's a little bit more elegant. It's faster acting. So yeah, we can definitely do that.
Hey, Brian, this is Mason. The next one that we got was, what other components do I need to be able to implement just enough PAM in my environment?
Yeah, so if you're really looking at going through the entire racetrack, if you will, if I pull up that slide here.
Thank you.
Oops. Build this guy out here. So if you're building out this entire thing, it really would require the entire stack, right? That entire platform. Now, nobody expects you to just bite all of that off at one time. I have customers that do. And trust me, I'd be very happy to sell you the entire thing all at one time. But you got to start somewhere. Right? And most people do start with the low-hanging fruit, which is vaulting those local accounts, right? Vaulting those shared accounts, even domain admin accounts. Right? One of the things you may have noticed, and I should have pointed out as I was doing the demo, because I talked about it in the slide deck, my -A account is vaulted. That's a great place to start, right? I don't know the password to my -A account. I have one. I'm the only one that can access it. I'm the owner of that account, but I don't know the password to it. I can check it out, but it's rotated as soon as I'm finished. That checkout's only valid for whatever amount of time you set by a policy. So that's a great place to start, right? Vaulting is very necessary, right? It's not the be all and end all, but it's a great place to start.
And that leads us right into the next one, Brian, which was, can Centrify actually be integrated with any Vault solution?
It can. Obviously we have our own Vault solution, that being the privileged access service, but we have a lot of customers that are using us on the authentication and privilege elevation side and using some of our competitors on the vaulting side. Again, would I prefer that you buy it all from me? Absolutely. But we do play well with others, right? It's a different mentality, right? Because when you're approaching things from a vault-only perspective, which our competitors do, they do that well. We all do, right? Vaulting is pretty standard these days, right? Vaulting accounts, controlling who has access to them, rotating them on a regular basis and as they're checked out. That's pretty standard stuff, right? More and more, a lot of us have adapted to, the newer model of things like secrets, right? For DevOps perspective, right? Humanless compute. We all do that to some degree or another. It's when you start building in those additional features, right? Having the client, giving the machine identity that enables the machine to protect itself as well, right? You can kind of think of it very similarly to Kerberos, right? Mm-hmm. Enabling single sign-on, having systems able to authenticate to each other, right? When systems are in an Active Directory environment, and when we're using the authentication service, joining those Linux systems in the AD, Kerberos is extended to them. Those systems can talk to each other without having to have passwords and service accounts coded into applications. With the privileged access service and the new C client, the account, or that computer, that machine has an account of its own, right? It has its own credential. Nobody has access to that credential but that machine. We're able to extend things like OAuth 2 and SAML and PKI to enable machines to talk to each other without having those things hard-coded, without having things like traditional application password management. We have to reach into the vault and inject it because that's still exposure. Everything's tokenized at that point. So it does provide an extra level of protection, but we can play well with others. When you have another vault, you get less functionality, but we do.
And speaking of others, we'll close it out with this one, Christine, I believe. The question was asked from Andre Allen. What are your top 3 differentiators in comparison to CyberArk?
Number one is the complexity, right? CyberArk, from a complexity standpoint, the number of moving parts that you have to have in place, from the PSM to the PSM for Windows to, they've got a separate, I can never remember all of their different acronyms for all of the different pieces that they have, but they've got one service that does the password rotation. They've got another service that does Unix and Linux, another service that does Windows. You got another service that does the session recording. And in your initial purchase, you get X number of each of those, but as you scale, you're going to need more than what's included, and they start to charge for each of those, right? You have to pay for the infrastructure that those things are running on as well. You have to have, in their traditional model at any rate, you have to have a physical server for your vault. So all of those things add on to the price. So total cost of ownership and complexity first and foremost, right? Our connector does all of that and we don't charge for it. That usually gets a little bit of attention, right? We're also, because we were built for the cloud, right? More and more organizations are moving into the cloud. And I can't tell you how many customers over the last, I've been with Centrify for a little over 4 years now, and it still happens, but it's happened a lot over the 4 years where people go, oh, we're not moving to the cloud. We're never moving to the cloud. We're very cloud averse. And then Tuesday happens. And on Tuesday, you get a new CTO or a new CIO. And they say, we're moving everything to the cloud. And you got to scramble. And what are you going to do? And those traditional on-prem vaults do not translate to that methodology, especially when you start looking at multi-cloud environments. Having that hub and spoke model that we have is another huge differentiator.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian and Centrify, for joining us today. Really appreciated this overview of your Identity-Centric PAM platform. That's all the time that we've got for today, so I'm going to close it out. Thank you to all of our attendees. We will send out your DoorDash gift codes as well as a replay of today's session by the end of the day this evening. Any other questions, you're welcome to shoot them over to IDMWorks or to Brian Carmen at Centrify. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next IAM Pro Series session.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Christine.